Well, took us long enough, I guess. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge, released in 2022 for various platforms including Nintendo Switch, which is what we're playing today, is supposedly a throwback to a simpler time. Kinda, sorta. Obviously, the source of inspiration being the old Turtles arcade games, the one the old people liked. And this is more of that, but with a lot of modern doohickeys like power meters and over-exaggerated super moves that feel like a fever dream or something. You can level things up, you have a world map, a story mode, an arcade mode that is old school or harder, or something. Later down the road they added a survival mode where you fight endless wave of baddies until you eventually don't. This came out a couple years ago, there's DLC to go along with it, which I did buy because sure, why not. The default package gives you a handful of characters to play with, obviously all 4 turtles, but you also have Casey Jones, you also have Master Splinter, and April O'Neil's stunt double. The real deal is probably kidnapped and stashed away somewhere or something. Subsequent DLC packs, that is paid of course, adds other characters such as Miyamoto Usagi of Usagi Yojimbo fame, Karai, who never appeared in the cartoon but this version takes inspiration from her appearances in the old Tournament Fighters, Mondo Gecko of Mighty Mutanimals fame, great comic by the way until they killed the entire team off, and one-note character Mona Lisa, who appeared in one episode of the cartoon and that's it, but that's enough to get chosen over whatever. You know what? It doesn't matter. So let's nail the obvious points out of the way. Visually, the game looks pretty slick. We're naturally copying the visual style and atmosphere of the 80s cartoon that this is largely based on, while taking cues from the Konami arcade titles that Shredder's Revenge takes large inspiration from. It looks the part, the animation is smooth as butter, each character is designed with enough charm and personality that they're a treat to guide to victory or beat to smithereens, depending on the context. The various settings throughout 80s Turtles cartoon lore are also nicely drawn. The brief intermissions that occur between stages are also nice looking. I have no issues with the game whatsoever, graphically speaking. It is a very vibrant, very colorful game that looks amazing and it runs silky smooth to boot. No complaints in this regard. And of course, one of the main draws was the surviving members of the original cartoon cast to do some one-liners for their characters. This is ultimately a minor thing because Shredder's Revenge isn't as talky as that other Turtles game that we looked at, whose name I forgot. But it's a nice little novelty that would have been enough of a sales pitch even if the gameplay was a total bummer, dude. Fortunately, we don't have that problem here because Shredder's Revenge is a perfectly fine beat-em-up brawler for the style of game that it's trying to emulate. Again, the idea is to take those old Konami arcade games, copy the stuff that made those games fun and memorable, and then add a bunch of modern doohickeys to make it appealing to the kids who need the extra bits more so than the old people do. And Tribute did a fine job in that regard. The simple and straightforward combat of those classic games have been retained. You attack with one button, jump with another, couple extra buttons for dashing and stuff. Hit detection is generally pretty solid, save for some minor misses here and there, but that's to be expected. I found throws to be easier to pull off here than in Turtles in Time, which is nice. There are some occasional gimmicks you could trash to help you clear away some more trash. Some pizza pies to either give you a health boost or temporary rush attack things. Needless to say, if you lived in some sort of alternate reality where the last Turtles game ever made was Turtles in Time in 1991, and all of a sudden this came along, you'd jump right in without a hitch. The speed might be a touch faster and the animation a bit brighter, but the core gameplay feels good, and had you stuck with that basic design, it would have been enough to tickle that nostalgic itch or whatever the case might be. But then they added more stuff on there. The combat evolved with extra bits. You could hold the attack button to perform a charged attack. Each character actually has varied attack styles and moves that match their characters and personalities. You have a super meter that charges with all the goons you beat up, which executes a special move that can clear a wider number of grunts or bring pain to a boss. You could even taunt, which I only realized until recently. Serves no real purpose other than to leave yourself open to a free hit, but there are amusing little bits nonetheless. And of course there's secret collectibles hidden throughout the stages along with little challenges for you to take on. Some are simple, go through a stage without dying, others are more involved, kill X number of enemies with gimmicks, score enough points and you level up your character, which will either involve a life bar extension or extra life or some other thing like an extra move or whatever. They're nice additions to make the game seem more substantial. Having supers is something neat for a pinch, though it's not really necessary to triumph. Leveling up characters take a while unless you stick with just the one, but the cast of characters are unique enough that they're all worth sampling at least once or twice. This applies to story mode, which gives you a map, challenges, saves your progress, lets you replay stages, that sort of thing, as well as the survival mode where you do the survival thing, get crystals and stuff. There's an arcade mode if you want to go more old school, limited lives and continues, though that's pretty much nullified if you choose free play, which gives you infinite lives pretty much, but it's pretty much the same game otherwise. Shredder's Revenge boasts a little over a dozen stages or so to conquer, and they all strike that nice balanced pace. None of the levels feel too brief, nor do they overstay their welcome. Well, anything that doesn't involve skateboards or airboards, that is, those are always lame, but the rest of it is just fine. There's always going to be the risk of this sort of thing being on the repetitive side of things, and indeed, trying to play through 12 to 15 levels worth of this stuff might be a little long in the tooth. Shredder's Revenge does at least try to throw new things your way with each new stage, new grunts to beat up, new gimmicks, and having up to 6 players on screen via local or online, if you can manage that many, that's bound to be a fun ride. Again, control is pretty simple to figure out. Attack, super, jump, taunt, whatever. It's responsive, everything feels slick. This is one finely tuned mean green machine. That's what the old people used to say, right? Okay. We already touched on the graphics, the visuals, and how slick this game looks in terms of recreating that older visual style and updating it enough to feel fresh. Sound, on the other hand, is one area where I'm not too particularly keen on. Yes, they brought back the original 87 cast to do some voiceovers, the ones still among the living or active at least, and yes, they do sound noticeably older, which is what naturally happens when you grow old. That's to be expected, and honestly, it doesn't really bother me. The new voices for the other characters, they sound fine, I guess. Sound effects are also sounding fine, cartoony, in line with the sort of sound you'd get from the old arcade titles. The only thing that really sours me somewhat, and that might be stretching it a bit, is the music. Not because it's bad or anything, it's highly energetic fare that matches the manic nature of the action and the brand, but the tracks feel a bit bland and samey. There wasn't a point where I was humming a melody or two like I would with the old games because all of it just blended together after a while. Again, it's decent fare for what it is, but nothing that really wowed me. Others might take a liking to this though, but it's not for me. Oh, and you could choose between the standard soundtrack and a remixed version that plays out in a pseudo NES style that honestly sounds worse and I don't really care for. Overall, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shredder's Revenge. Well, I'm not going to clamor this as a return to the glory days of TMNT arcade gaming like everyone else seems to be clamoring. This didn't get me in the feels or anything like that. There's one too many modern conveniences or contrivances to give me that sense of remember the good old days or whatever the case may be, especially when there's a Cowabunga collection that does a more than satisfactory job of remembering the good old days when things were actually simple. I'm sounding a bit more sour about this than I actually am because I'm really just over this whole nostalgia-driven hyperbole that a lot of these throwback things come with. The only real reason for me to be sour about this thing was not coming around to it sooner because once you push all that nonsense aside and judge the game on its own merits, Shredder's Revenge is a fucking great game. It's a modern take on a classic style of arcade beat-em-up that Konami once specialized in, and certainly a solid template for all these other Johnny-come-latelys to emulate with their own licensed properties. There's a lot of stuff to play around with if you're into these sort of games, and the additional DLC adds a bit more value if you want to toss the dough, as it were. Certainly makes for a great party game with a bunch of buddies and whatnot, which is where those old arcade titles shined the most. But even as a single-player romp, this is a genuinely fun game that actually sees more playtime than usual these days, which should say something about its staying power. Personally, and I don't usually say this sort of thing often because it comes across as needlessly hyperbolic, but I do feel that Shredder's Revenge is perhaps the best modern Ninja Turtles game available on the current platforms. Could that be too much of a stretch? Perhaps, but it's just the way I feel about it. It looks good, sounds good, plays good, feels good. So, yeah, Shredder's Revenge. Fun game, good times. No feels, Bossa Nova, Chevy Nova, something about Elvis in Blue Hawaii. Yep, go play this. This is fun.